Chris Lee of Southeastern14.com here for a special episode of the podcast today, joined as always by Blake Lovell. And we've got a special guest. We'll call him a college basketball utility man because he does a lot of stuff. One of the prominent things he does is he runs Bracketeer.org. Rocco Miller joins us. He is somewhere in the vicinity of Arizona's basketball arena tonight, trying to get in as we speak, I think. Rocco, thanks for joining us. How's that going on getting in the arena, by the way?
Thanks for having me, gentlemen. It's okay. You know, they told me yesterday, 4:00 Mountain. I tried to cheat the system a little bit and go in 30 minutes early, and the security guard was a rule stickler. So taking the call today from the rental car, but no problem at all. We got a good less than 2 hours till tip-off out here. So all the time in the world to talk brackets and SEC basketball.
Well, it's a fun time of the year. We are about a month out from the really good stuff. And this, to me, is the time that I really start paying attention. To me, other than maybe 10, 15, 20 teams, a lot of this is meaningless until we get to this point. But now the teams have played other good teams and had a chance to stockpile quality wins or miss those chances. And to me, this has always been about the time that I really start paying attention to brackets and such.
Yeah, I mean, it's the most exciting time of the year, and you're not alone in that. There's a good portion of the country that, they get football, they get through NFL football, and this is about the week right after the Super Bowl where we've got 100% engagement across all sports fans that have any interest in the lead up to March Madness. There are some of us that are a little cuckoo bananas about this sport, like me, that do it all year long. But yeah, it's such a fun time of year. You know, you mentioned earlier that you've been on a bunch of podcasts today. I'm in the same boat. I do my bracket releases on Mondays and Fridays, and it's pretty much nonstop shows on those days now that we're in February. But wouldn't trade it for anything else in the world, man. It's such a fun thing to be a part of.
Well, Cuckoo About Hoops explains why you and Blake have become so close. So, Blake, with that, I'm going to throw it to you to lead things off today with where we're going to go, which is going to be spending a lot of time talking about SEC teams and where they might place in the bracket. So, with that, lead us off, my man.
Yeah, Rocco was one of the early adopters of the, speaking of Cuckoo, the guy myself that started an SEC basketball website 6 years ago. You talk about Cuckoo. I heard that enough from other people. But, hey, here we are now, Rocco, talking about, we're gonna go through a lot of our Twitter questions here because we've got a lot of them. But believe it or not, for everyone who thought that, people were cuckoo for covering SEC basketball 6 years ago, our first question kind of tells you how far things have come. And Patrick has this question, and I think it's very interesting. He wants to know, can Auburn and Kentucky put enough space between them and, let's say, schools like Kansas or Duke, you can insert any other teams there you want, to secure, 2 number 1 seeds for the SEC before one of them inevitably loses at the conference tournament? So obviously, I think, Rocco, best case scenario to get to that point is for these two teams to certainly, play their best the rest of the regular season. If they meet in the SEC tournament title game, that obviously boosts your resume as well. What do you think right now in terms of where these two stand in terms of, hey, can we get 2 SEC teams as number 1 seeds?
Yeah, great question. So, the way it breaks down right this minute is I think there's 7 bona fide teams competing for a number 1 seed. And that would be in order for me right now is Gonzaga, Auburn, Arizona, Kansas, Kentucky, Baylor, Purdue would be the 7. So you have Auburn and Kentucky in that mix already right this minute. So, and there is a good scenario there where that could come true just based on the fact alone that Auburn has 5 games remaining. None of them are against Kentucky. If they were to go 5-0 in those last 5, that would include a critical, and I mean critical, marquee road win at Tennessee, which is coming up in the next couple of weeks here. And then Kentucky's schedule also has a nice piece of gold in it, as they will go to Arkansas before the end of this year. Not to mention they're going to host Alabama and LSU coming up. So 3 really good wins for Kentucky. Auburn gets another great road win. And so if they both went 5-0 and entered the SEC tournament, then you add more wins on top of that. Let's just say they get to the SEC final. One of them wins. Since Auburn's in the lead now for the league, I'm sure they're all rooting for Kentucky at that point just to get the 2 number 1s. That's certainly a scenario where they would both have not only the resume to be number 1 seeds, but chances are pretty good that those other 5 I mentioned, besides Gonzaga, would probably fall at least once between now and then. So there's your scenario to root for. Again, it can be a benefit that they're not playing each other on the schedule anymore until possibly the SEC tournament. So I can certainly foresee that.
Rock, I want to ask you a follow-up question there. You talked about a win at Tennessee being critical for Auburn. If they don't win in Knoxville, which most teams don't, is that a thing in a standalone sense that drops them a seed?
I don't think so, because Auburn's done so much good work already. I like to say every game that you play in your season is one part of your story for the year. So of course, when you play those big games, like when they play Tennessee or when they swept Alabama, for example, those are all one piece of the pie, right? So the body of work speaks for itself, and a win at Tennessee for Auburn is just kind of a bonus game at that point. Right now they're 1A and 1B in the nation with Gonzaga. There is some space there right now between them and the next 2 number 1 seeds, which I would say are Arizona and Kansas as we speak. So Auburn can definitely lose that and stay at 1 seed. I don't think that's an issue at all. Where they can start to possibly stumble is losing any games at home. They only have 2 left. That's Ole Miss and South Carolina. Those are non-forecasted tournament teams. So they certainly don't want to lose anything at home. And, probably don't want to bow out early in the SEC tournament and leave the door open there. But the way it looks right now, we're talking about an Auburn Tigers team that 21 of their wins have come against the top 3 quadrants, which means they're not what we call guarantee games against the bottom part of college basketball in quad 4. And they have another 15 of those of the 21 in the top 2. They just have done so much stacking of the chips, if you will, to earn clout. And so it's not very far to fall at this point because they've already established so much.
Rocco, speaking of Tennessee, I'm going to ask a question from Grant here, and I trust Grant's knowledge that I haven't checked these numbers, but I'm going to trust that he's right on these. So we're talking about Auburn and Kentucky. Grant wants to know, why is Kentucky considered to be on the 1-2 line while Tennessee is currently on the 3-4 line? He asked, if you look over the resumes and team sheets, the only difference is Kentucky's 5-5 in quad 1, Tennessee's 5-6, both undefeated in the other 3 quads, plus Tennessee has 2 wins over top 3 teams. Again, I've not fact-checked all these, but I trust that Grant has them correct. But I think at least Tennessee, and we've talked about this a lot recently on the podcast, about certainly Tennessee is playing their way in the direction of moving up. There's no question about that based on how they played over the last month. But where do things kind of sit right now for Tennessee? And I guess from Grant's question, how does that compare to where Kentucky is at right now?
Yeah, Tennessee is a dangerous team as they've shown. That was a tremendous performance in their double-digit win over Kentucky this week. They've also beaten Arizona at home. They've got a lot of great wins at home. But every selection committee chairman that gets interviewed every year after the bracket comes out, or even you'll see a mini interview this Saturday when they do the bracket reveal, which is the first 16 seeds, which are all the 1, 2, 3, and 4 seeds. They'll tell you that what matters the most is who you play, where you play them, and how did you do. And what they're really saying there is wins away from home matter the most. So when you're looking at a resume, those road wins are gold. Even neutral court wins are kind of silver, if you will. I think what Tennessee's missing right now is a great road win. They really don't have any against a team that's projected to make the tournament at this point, which gives them one last opportunity this Saturday at Arkansas. So they can check that box if they get that win this Saturday. There won't be a lot holding them back, but you're talking about comparing them to a Kentucky team that has one of the best road wins in all of college basketball when they went to Fog Allen and beat Kansas in the SEC Big 12 Challenge by a large margin. It was an incredible performance for the Wildcats. They've also won at Alabama this year. And so that gives Kentucky, 3 what we call quad 1A wins. So the actual team sheets these days in the last couple of years, they'll split quad 1 in half. So you can see what are the elite wins in that top half of quad 1, and then what are 1B, still quad 1 wins, but not quite the upper echelon wins. And Kentucky's got 3 of those today. Tennessee's got 2, a lot of little comparisons like that. Now, I don't think they're that far off from each other at this point. Kentucky's pretty solidly a 2 seed. I think Tennessee's pretty solidly a 3 seed right now. Their metrics are through the roof. If you average the 3 predictive metrics that are on the NCAA team sheets, they're averaging out between number 8 and number 9 in the country. which means you would have to kind of go out of bounds to put them lower than a 3 seed. So I think they've earned that 3 seed at this point. They'll be there in my bracket tomorrow, so check for that. But yeah, they're not that far apart besides those factors.
Rocco, these teams get put under a microscope the higher we go up in seeding, and Kentucky winning at Kansas, I'm glad you mentioned that because that was a big win. But Kentucky's out-of-conference schedule before that was not strong. Of course, they lost to Duke opening night, lost at Notre Dame, and I get that was a kind of a different Kentucky team. But is there any chance that the schedule Kentucky played out of conference comes into focus and maybe dings the Cats a little bit as the committee starts to separate really the elite of the elite?
It can. I think at this level, when you're at the top of the board and you're sorting out 1s and 2s and 3s, it's, if anything, a tiebreaker because you're looking at, besides Gonzaga and Houston maybe, all the other teams in this mix are in Power 6 conferences. In basketball, the Big East would be also considered a power conference. So we have 6 in our sport, and all these teams have so many samples, right? The data is pretty powerful by the time you get to March that you typically don't need to go to strength of schedule to break those ties, but you can. I mean, it's there for them to look at. I also would say that Kentucky's sitting at 118th right now in non-conference strength, but there's teams close to them like Purdue's 218th and Baylor's 198th, and a little bit lower, Providence is 121. Texas Tech's 147. So as long as it's not ridiculously poor, like in the 300s or high 200s, I don't think it's going to be that big of a factor for this part of the selection. Where it really comes into play is those last couple selections on the bubble. Your intent to schedule as a power team kind of means a lot because if you gave yourself an easy road, to 12-0 non-conference, it's not quite as impressive as a team that challenged themselves and maybe went 9-3 or 10-2. So that's what I would say to that.
All right, Rocco, here's where you earn your money. Let's get into the weird part of the SEC because there have been some teams that have just been, you just shake your head at. And the one above all else, I think we all would agree on this, is Alabama. And Royal Payne on Twitter wants to know how high Alabama could get if they were to go on a little run here down the stretch the rest of the way. He puts it best, such a strange combination of great wins and inexplicable losses. He says if they, let's say they go 4-1 the rest of the season, win 2 in the SEC tournament, finish 23-11, could the 4 seed be a ceiling? Obviously, a lot of hypotheticals in there in terms of what Alabama's remaining schedule is, who they play in the SEC tournament. I know there's a lot of unknowns. If you talk about the remaining schedule, they've got at Kentucky, at Vanderbilt, out LSU, home games against South Carolina A&M. But to me, Rocco, and we've talked about this, Chris and I, Alabama is such an interesting team this season because I don't see a lot of teams that have the group of wins that they have at the top portion of that. But as we've also talked about, there are also no other SEC teams that have lost to both Missouri and Georgia. So that is just, Alabama to me is just one of those really wild and fascinating studies based on how they played this year.
Right. We seem to get a few of these each year, Blake. It's interesting that you get such a big cluster of great wins. Alabama is actually one of the top teams in the country, certainly the top team in the area that they're bracketed in right now. I have them as a projected 5 seed. But if you look at all the 4s, 5s, 6s, and beyond, the only team that compares to the amount of tournament teams that Alabama's beaten is Marquette. Marquette's beaten 8. Alabama's beaten 7. Again, I'm looking team by team. I'm not looking at rankings. And I think the actual committee, they've told me over the years, this is what they look at. And I'm glad they do because a lot of people get caught up in the quad game. What's your record against quad 1? What's your record against quad 2? Well, to me, it's more important that you beat Miami in a neutral court down in Orlando, which is what Alabama did, who might be ranked 67th, and that's showing up as like a quad 2 game, than beating a team that's not in the tournament at home that might have really good metrics and show up as a quad 1, just as a loose example. And in general, Alabama's resume, usually if you have a lot of good and a lot of bad, the good will still win out over the bad, as long as it's not like an incredible amount of bad. Of course, they've got a couple inexplicable losses, as you said, at Mizzou, at UGA. But Alabama, they've got one of the best wins in college basketball. They went to Seattle, Washington, where I'm originally from, in fact, and That was 18,000 plus Gonzaga fans. I mean, make no joke about that. And they went in there and played one of the best games of the season for any team. And you can't take that away from them. And again, they backed that up with 6 other tournament level wins already. And then you look at the rest of their schedule, Blake. They'll go to Rupp Arena, which is obviously, a huge opportunity. No harm, no foul if they don't get the win. They'll also go to LSU. So another chance at another great road win there to move their way up the seed list to get back in that top 4 discussion. There are other games they'll want to make sure they take care of business. They'll go to Vandy, but they'll host Texas A&M and South Carolina. So they certainly don't want to drop those home games. But they've been pretty strong at Coleman all year. Those two ugly losses were at least road losses, and that won't kill you at the end.
All right, Rocco, Florida. Let's talk about them. They're an interesting one because that's another team we've been talking about a lot. And here's the question. Sam just wants to know, plain and simple. Let's say Florida goes 18-12. What would they need to do in the SEC tournament to get in? I know that's also hard to know because a lot of that's going to be what side of the bracket are you on, who are you playing, those kind of things. And I think there's still a lot to be determined SEC seeding wise. Maybe outside of the top 4. I feel like the top 4 are pretty settled, but let's just talk about Florida in terms of where they are right now. I think we've said this a lot. Florida, the good news for them, even though they lose that game against A&M and they've had some losses they would like to take back, Texas Southern at the very top of that list. But look, they've still got Auburn, they've still got Arkansas, and they've still got Kentucky. What are the common denominators between all 3 of those? They're all in Gainesville. Where do things stand for Florida right now? And certainly I know that they can play their way back into this thing. But let's say in this scenario that Sam brings up, they're 16-10 right now. Let's say they finish, 18-12, whatever that would be, I guess at that point, 18-13. I'm not sure what the record would be, but where do things stand for the Gators and what do they need to do?
Yeah, I think out of those 3 home games, to win 2 of those would be pretty big. All those teams are exceptional. Arkansas is red hot right now. They've won 10 out of 11. And, of course, Auburn and Kentucky are right there at the top of the board competing for number 1 seed. So those would be elite wins. Now, Arkansas, I think, would probably fall somewhere between 1A and 1B, but still very important for a team on the bubble like Florida. They are about my 10th team out right now. But, again, this is a really strong bubble. I've said this on some other shows recently. And I say that because when you grade out a resume and you see, what are the good things, what are the bad things, which is basically what I'm asking about every team. Is there a way you would still select them? There's about an additional 5 or 6 teams right now I would be okay with selecting. Usually it's the other way around. Usually we're scrambling to find 5 or 6 to fill out the bracket with because the bubble's pretty weak. So Florida's got a lot of other teams to compete with as they try to work their way back up. But those opportunities that you spoke about at home represent something that most of the bubble teams don't get the chance to have. They'll also probably get another chance or 2 at the SEC tournament. And the interesting thing about that, and I think we talked about this on last year's show, is, the committee starts to wrap up a lot of their work Thursday and Friday. So if you're in that early part of the bracket, maybe they get a big quarterfinal game. You got to make sure you get that win then so they can, plan to move you up the board and get you in the tournament. It's kind of an interesting little nuance there, but we'll see how the scenarios play out. Their road games are against Georgia and Vandy that are on the schedule. I think it'll be important for them to demonstrate they can get a couple more road wins. Right now, they're a 5-7 road team. They only have 1 road win in the top 2 quadrants. That's against South Carolina, a team not forecasted to make the tournament or really that close to it. And so one thing Florida's not going to have on their resume is a road win against a tournament team, unless Vanderbilt makes a crazy run. So that's a big hole in their resume, and they've got to do some things now to make up for that.
Rocco, excuse me, I want to ask you about the Colin Castleton injury and how that plays in. He missed 6 games. Florida went 4-2 without him. The losses were at Tennessee, at Ole Miss. The Tennessee game was a 7-point loss. The Ole Miss was by 16, so maybe you can say that one didn't matter. How much do you think that factors in? And, of course, the other thing, too, is a lot of teams have injuries, right? There's a lot of them in the SEC, so you've got to weigh that injury against maybe some other bubble teams that have injuries, too. How many other bubble teams you think Florida is competing against have situations like that where they had a key player hurt? And how much do you think the Castleton injury gets factored in?
Yeah, so this year has been even more extreme than any other year I can remember, because you had teams with COVID shutdowns, you had players that missed a month or more with long-term, illnesses, for example, and then of course just common injuries like Castleton's example. Florida's been dinged up in other ways too. I know Applebee's been banged up and others. So it's an interesting situation. It is something that the committee can talk about. I think the most famous example of that was way back when Kenyon Martin tore his ACL in the conference tournament. It knocked Cincinnati from a 1 seed to a 2 seed. I think the second most famous example is Bonzie Colson for Notre Dame, missing a good chunk of the season, I think 15 or more games, but he came back the week before the bracket went out. And guys like me said it didn't matter. They lost too many games. And the committee came out and said they were the last team out. So that's something we really have to take seriously. Now, with all that said, you look at like a VCU, just to give you an example of a bubble team. Ace Baldwin's their point guard. He missed the first 3 months, miraculously came back with a ruptured Achilles injury. And now they're a much better team with Baldwin. So, they might be looked at differently than what their resume says. You got a couple other examples like that out there. And to answer your overall question, Chris, I would say the Florida Gators, they need to be in that situation where they're either right on the cut of getting selected or not, to have that really be evaluated and put under the microscope, or maybe to try to get out of like the first four and into the main bracket instead of having to go to Dayton. It could be looked at really closely for that decision as well. But if they're not that close and they're safely in or safely out, it probably won't even get discussed. So it really just comes down to where they land.
Rocco, let me ask you about the two other teams that are projected to be in right now. And then I think I'm going to let Chris ask you about two teams that I guess are not projected to be in, but could play their way in, barring a wild run, supposedly. But Arkansas and LSU, you can go whichever way you want to go with these two. I mean, Arkansas, I'd argue, is had a better month than maybe anyone in the SEC to this point, just based on completely turning their season around, how they played over the past month or so after losing 5 of 6 there, and right now they're playing as well as anybody. Lose that game by 1 at Alabama, but take that out, and I mean they've just been fantastic. And then there's LSU, who has also started to turn things around. They had their own sort of stretch there where they lose 6 of 7, as we've talked about, and I don't think that's going to factor in maybe necessarily. But one of the things we really talked about is, in a lot of those games they lost, they didn't have Xavier Pinson. He's one of their best players, and so that's something that I'm sure also may factor in, maybe not to a large extent, but that's at least for people like us who watch it. There was a clear difference not having him on the floor versus having him on the floor. Mm-hmm. But LSU 19-7 right now, 7-6 in the league. Arkansas, as was said, playing really as well as anyone, 20-6, 9-4. Where do things stand for you on those two right now?
Yeah, I mean, they're both sitting in real solid shape overall, just in terms of can't really foresee them playing their way out. I mean, they're both excellent teams, loaded with talent, NBA level talent in certain cases on both teams. So LSU is a 5 today. Arkansas would be a 6. And LSU, they're in a situation where they don't have the spectacular road win yet. They'll get another opportunity, 2 more opportunities that they'll play at Arkansas later this year. They'll also play at Kentucky. So again, another team that gets a bonus opportunity. The good thing about having 3 such strong teams at the top of your conference is the other teams that are trying to play their way up get those chances because you have so much strength there. And if anybody can pull it off, they'll help their chances or they'll improve their seed tremendously. So LSU gets that chance. Arkansas, they'll get a chance like that too. They play at Tennessee. They actually get Tennessee twice, both at home and away. So that's a really interesting series coming up. They also host Kentucky and LSU. So Bud Walton's going to be rocking these next 3 games, these last 3 of the season. Pretty exciting finish for Arkansas. But also they'll need to play extremely well to get those W's, as you both know. And they also have a tricky game at Florida, a team that, we just talked about. So Arkansas, they could go 2-3. They could even go 1-4 if they don't play well. I think they've done enough with their win at LSU. That's a really strong road win to anchor off of. They've got 14 wins against the top 3 quadrants. Can't take those away. There's just a lot going for them when you compare them to the rest of the options in this part of the bracket. They're also doing very well in the metrics. So Arkansas is averaging out to about the 21st best team in the country with all the predictives. and LSU's averaging out to between 15th and 16th best team in the country. And I think that's more important than ever because since the net was introduced in 2019, when you start to see the seed lines like 4 through 10, where you're not talking about the top 2 or 3 lines, you're not talking about the bubble, you're talking about the teams that are safely in. Now you got to figure out how to seed them. It seems to me, and the way I'm doing my forecast more this year, is the committee wants to more prioritize those teams on how they're going to play in the tournament versus their resume metrics. And I think that's kind of fascinating. I don't have a huge problem with it, but that's going to help teams like Arkansas and LSU because the Ken Palms of the world think they're going to perform well in the tournament. And, maybe they deserve a 7 seed in Arkansas' case. They might actually get a 5 or a 6 because some of those models that are out there.
Yeah, boy, that last part was really interesting. All right, a couple of teams, and I guess that's a good segue into where I'm going to go next. Mississippi State, just one of the most disappointing teams in the country to me. Just cannot beat anybody on the road to save its life. What kind of needle does State have to thread to work its way in the tournament? I'm presuming that's going to have to include not only a strong finish to the regular season, but also drawing a couple of NCAA tournament bound teams and beating those teams in Tampa.
You're probably right, Chris. All they have left now in terms of tournament teams out of the last 6 games on their schedule is a home one with Auburn. Now, you beat Auburn at home. Obviously, that's a big statement. You'll make the committee look at you a little closer, of course, if you can pull that off if you're Mississippi State. They also have 3 more road games that are not tournament caliber road games, but the ones at South Carolina and Texas A&M would register as a top 2 quadrant. It's better than having nothing in there. When I'm looking at the bubble, I'm looking at road wins against those top 2. But right now, as you said, Mississippi State's 0 for the season on road games. And so they're just flat out not selectable at this point. So they'll want to get probably both of those wins if they can. Everything we've seen so far tells us they won't. But, things can change. I like this Mississippi State team coming into the year. I also thought they played a heck of a game against Colorado State, and they let that thing slip away. They had, I think, a 17-point lead at one point, end up losing that game down in Fort Worth. That was in December. And since that game, it feels like a lot of these road losses, they're right in there, and they end up losing by a couple possessions late. I think that just comes down to maybe not having a clutch or a closer or somebody that can finish out games for them. So it's really hard to forecast that trend changing all of a sudden here with just a couple of weeks to go. But there is the ability, of course, to get hot, win 6 in a row. That would include a Auburn home win, at least 2 solid road wins that you can put on your resume, and then maybe get a win or 2 in Tampa to add to it. The good thing for Mississippi State is they're still close to top 50 in net. I think they're like 55 right now. And, with 6 more wins, if they can get those, I mean, it's a big if, you would start to help all the other categories as well. So not all hope is lost, but they're on super thin ice.
Well, the next one is way off the radar, but once you bank some big wins and get a few more, that's when you start putting yourself in position, which leads us to Vanderbilt, which has beaten BYU and Hawaii on a neutral floor. It is won at Arkansas, where not a lot of people are doing that, obviously, and beaten LSU recently. Let's say Vandy gets a home win against Alabama, goes 4 or 5 down the stretch, which would include beating either Mississippi State on the road and then Florida at home. One of those two. Let's say Vanderbilt at that point is 9-9 in the league. I think the net in the 70s, maybe low 80s. Obviously, it would jump by that point, but if we get to that spot, what kind of shape is Vandy going? I'm presuming that's going to take some more work in the conference tournament, but I think at that point that it could get interesting.
I think you're right. And I think it's not out of the realm of possibility because of the fact that Vanderbilt games at home. We just talked about how Mississippi State has trouble winning close games. If they can go down and get a win at the hump, I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility. The other 3 are very manageable, in my opinion. The game at Bama is going to be tough.
That'll be in Nashville. Yeah, and State will be in Starkville.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me on that. But I do think the other 3 they can win and may even be favored in. So if they get those 5 wins, I think the biggest problem Vanderbilt has right now is they're just 2-8 against the first quadrant. If you combine the first 2, they're just 3-10, and then in quad 3 they have 2 more losses, which gets them up to their full 12 losses. Now you start to balance some of that with a 5-game winning streak, of course. I think the two that we headlined for Vandy, the at Mississippi State and the home Alabama, would get you to 4-8 in the first quadrant, and then it gets them in the conversation. Definitely no guarantee. I agree the net would go up. For most teams, the net is more about sorting your opponents versus your own team, unless you're not in a power conference. So again, like, your own net is not something typically you get selected on if you're in a power conference, but you also don't want to be so far out of bounds that you're looking at, we were looking at Rutgers earlier this week at 81, and we were like, man, it's really hard to select them, even though they have such great, so many great wins. Now with enough wins, you'll play your way into a selectable position, and Vandy would have that. Now, they probably, just looking at this quadrant breakdown, Chris, I think they'll need to get a couple wins on top of the 5-game winning streak to win out. You're right, it's out of bounds, but it's not unheard of. We see a team or two every year that we're not talking about come out of nowhere, get hot down the stretch. I think last year, NC State, nobody was talking about them. They won their last 5 in a row. If they would have beat Virginia in the ACC tournament, they might have been in. So, yeah, it's probably going to happen somewhere. Why not Vandy?
Yeah, Vandy did this Luke Cornett's last year, although much tougher strength of schedule, and just started racking up wins. So it's kind of fresh on the mind. But, yeah, the follow-up question to that is, like, we're bombarding you with everything in the world. How many devices and pieces of paper you're having to juggle as we're just killing you with these questions?
I'm an old school guy, Chris. I've got an Excel workbook that I use every season for the last decade. And, fortunately, with some of the platforms I get to participate in, we get to interview various selection committees, either over the summer or, we've even gotten a couple here during the regular season. I'll also take part in the bracket reveal this Saturday right after the CBS show ends. They're opening it up for media availability. So I'm just kind of a leech on all these committee guys to try to figure out what they actually care about. And so as the seasons go on, as lessons are learned, I'm updating this with different fields that I think are relevant. And I'm also trying to get rid of stuff that doesn't matter. So when you're asking the questions about the different teams, I'm telling you that the things I like, the things I don't like, and does it make sense to select them or not? I try to just keep everything within that scope.
All right, Rocco. Speaking of that, a couple of general rapid-fire questions here. You don't have to go too in-depth on these, but non-SEC questions that I think are at least fascinating. We got these from Twitter, too, just about the NCAA tournament and the process itself. All right, Jason wants to know, not directly SEC-related, but what are the chances John Rothstein's idea for the first 4 comes to fruition? Now, for those who don't know, John has continued to push this for a while now about the NCAA needing to alter the first 4 to make the Tuesday, Wednesday games only feature the final 8 at-large teams, which would allow, of course, all of the automatic qualifiers to at least be in the round of 64, so they would go play your normal tournament game instead of playing one of the play-in games. Rocco, what do you think? Any chance we ever see that?
It's not something I've heard discussed on a serious level. Now, if somebody like John Rothstein's pushing it, maybe it does get discussed sooner than later. So
right.
you never want to say never. I'm an advocate of the little guys more than anything. So I would actually kind of like that, because that would mean all those small conferences would avoid the first 4. They would all get to go straight into the bracket. It would probably actually help 1s and 2 seeds because you actually end up getting stronger 16s and 15s right now. Because they're fighting for spots on the 16 line. So if you think about that, they might actually have an easier game with John's idea. But beyond that, I haven't heard anything really taken seriously or introduced in an off-season meeting at this point.
All right, and then Jim Root, fantastic. One of the huge part of the 3-man weave, as we know. Just a fantastic resource and follow on Twitter at Second Chance Points. Does great stuff for the Action Network, Field to 68, all that good stuff. So Jim asked another great question here. He says, if you guys were the committee, we're not guessing here what the committee would do. He makes that specific. How would you treat teams with, let's say, wide gaps? And he really emphasizes the wide here. Wide gaps between the resume and the predictive / quality metrics. I think we may have touched on this a little bit earlier, Rocco, but basically that is the question. We're talking about the resume versus those predictive / quality metrics. That is something that I think has always been a very interesting discussion when it comes to making that process of selecting the teams.
Absolutely. Yeah, everything I've done is modeled after what I learned from the committee, so I can put the best possible forecast out for fans to bank on. So I'm kind of conditioned that way over, like I said, over a decade now. But my own personal opinion is you should be earning your way into the tournament, especially for selection and especially for, these top 3 or 4 seeds, which are really important because the top 4 seeds are protected seeds that get geographical advantages. The 13s, 14s, 15s, and 16 seeds are not allowed to be close to the venue itself because of the fact that they're protected. That's what the term means. I think it's within 100 miles or more you have to travel outside of if you're one of those seeds. So I think those are really important to be resume based versus predictive. Now, this new era of predictive, I've always been a big believer in the metrics. Been following KenPom since before he became a household name. And I think I kind of like the fact that the middle of the bracket, they are seeding more on that just because I get it. It's a multi-billion-dollar tournament every year. You want to put the teams with the best chances to get to the Final Four in the right seeds if you can help it. And if it's not affecting selection, I can live with that. My other pet peeve, I guess, just on this topic is putting teams that win their leagues, especially if they win their league and their league tournament, happened multiple times last year with like St. Bonaventure and Loyola Chicago, for example, putting them in the 8-9 game. It drives me crazy because you look at all the data over all the history, the 8-9, no matter which line you're on, you have a 10% or less chance to make it to the second weekend. Whereas if you're a 7 or a 10, you have like a 25% chance. I would say we should penalize the teams that barely make it in. If they're not in the first 4, of course, let's take the next 8 and put them in the 8-9 game and make that, let them really earn their way out of there and give the 1 seed a little bit more credit for being a 1 seed. I mean, that's just my own personal little touch that I've thought through over the last few years.
Blake, I'll give you the floor to ask any questions, and if you don't have any, I'll throw this one to Rocco, whether there's any storylines that maybe we didn't touch on that particularly would affect the SEC that we didn't get to today.
No, I just want to, again, make sure everyone follows Rocco's stuff. As he said, he updates his bracket. You can follow him on Twitter at Rocco Miller 8, and we'll put that stuff in the links to all the stuff we do, too. That way you can just click on the link, find his stuff there. But yeah, Rocco, anything else you want to wrap up with? Obviously, we touched on really all the SEC stuff. I know there are a lot of things, storyline-wise, nationally that could play into where some of these SEC teams are at. But anything you kind of have your eye on here as we get closer and closer to March?
One of the teams that really stands out like a sore thumb in kind of in between some SEC teams right now, I've got them between Tennessee and LSU, is the Houston Cougars. They're a team that plays in the league that they dominate for the most part. Now, they lost 2 in a row last week. They've dealt with a plethora of injuries this year, but they're tenacious. They have depth, and chances are pretty good they're going to win the majority of the rest of their games and end up in a protected seed position. I think that's a team for SEC teams to pay attention to, or SEC fans to pay attention to, because last year they were sitting in this 4 or 5 area around this time, and a bunch of teams kept losing. Houston kept creeping up, and then Houston ended up the 2 seed. I think we all know what happens next. They go to the Final Four. And I just think because of the fact that they're in the American and you get enough coverage of almost all the power conferences every single day, a lot of people fall asleep on them, but they're a very dangerous team, and they're going to benefit from other teams beating up on each other. So just keep your eye on Houston.
Rocco, this is tremendous stuff. We always enjoy it. We may have you on again before we even get to the bracket reveal, because I know, as we said, there's a lot of things that could sort of play out in different ways in the SEC in these final 5 or 6 games in the regular season. So always enjoy it. Thanks for the time. Enjoy the game tonight. As I'm looking here, looks like Arizona has a 99.6% chance of beating Oregon State. So if we're recording this now and anyone listen to this, we're going to put this out on Friday morning. If Oregon State pulls the big upset, I want you to think about Rocco and the 0.4% chance that he walked into that building thinking that Arizona could lose that game. So.
Absolutely, Blake. I appreciate that. And if somehow Oregon State wins, I'll probably be littering your timeline with photos and videos.
We appreciate it, Rocco. Thanks, man.
Rocco, thanks for joining us. We'd love to catch up with you more as we get closer to the big dance.
That sounds great. Anytime, you guys. Thank you so much.